Nothing stated by Steve Bartlett during the Fight Back with Steve show is intended to be legal advice, and appearing on the show does not create an attorney-client relationship with Steve Bartlett. Before taking legal action, it is advisable to consult with an attorney of your choice. The views and opinions expressed by the callers and guests of the Fight Back with Steve show are solely opinionated by those individuals and are not necessarily the expressions and viewpoints of Steve Bartlett or Talkwat Studios.
Hi, it's Monday night, 9 o'clock. You know what time that is? It's time for Fight Back with Steve Bartlett. I know you might be wanting to watch that thing on CBS. It's called A Basketball Game. I've heard of it. It's this NCAA tournament finals, and Connecticut, Kentucky, they win every year anyway. Who cares which one wins? Dayton got eliminated, which is where I went to school. So who really cares if Kentucky or UConn win? Who cares about basketball when you can be watching the Fight Back with Steve Bartlett show, right? Because the one thing that the NCAA tournament has never won is they never won a Talkie Award. Never. In the whole history of the NCAA tournament from the 1940s, they have never won a Talkie Award. But yet, this last weekend, on Friday night, at the first annual Talkie Awards, the Fight Back with Steve Bartlett show won the Talkie Award for Best Legal and Political Show. I have it right here to prove to you. Yes, the Talkie Award 2014 Best Law or Political Talk Show, Fight Back with Steve Bartlett. I have no idea how I won this award. I have no idea who the voters were. I heard it's a panel of judges, which is really strange because in my regular life, I normally piss judges off, so I have no idea how I was able to actually get some to like me. But whoever they are, thank you so much. One myth that isn't true is I did not pay off the judges. I did not bribe them to vote for the show for whatever reason. I guess they liked it. They liked what I was doing, and I'm very appreciative of that. I'm very appreciative of the viewers out there who call in, who watch the show, who support the show. I'm really thankful for you. Even if you disagree with me, particularly if you disagree with me, please call in the show. I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts. Debate with me. That's what the show's about. But again, I did not pay off any judges because I don't believe that voting and money should go hand in hand. Which takes me to what the topic of the show is today. The topic of today's show is about campaign finance reform, the history of the law about that, the way the law works when it comes to candidates spending money and then individuals giving money to candidates, individuals advertising on their own. So I want to talk to you about that. It's going to probably be boring. It's probably going to be complicated. I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm going to do the best I can to try to educate you on what the law used to be, how it's changed, what the law is now, and what I think is going to happen in the future, okay? So the history of politics and money in the United States have gone hand in hand. It's happened, the Founding Fathers wrote about it when they came up with the Constitution. Madison warned about factions in government, and the whole idea of political parties campaigning turned into spending a lot of money to try to get elected. It goes all the way back to the 1830s when Andrew Jackson was president. Andrew Jackson would have people who worked in government and had federally government jobs and would require them to kick back money each week from their paycheck to support his candidacy. It was totally corrupt, but that's how it actually was. And this type of money in politics went on through the 19th century. It got really popular during the after the Civil War, in which both the Republican and the Democratic parties became shills for big corporate business. They became owned basically by the robber barons, the rich tycoons that were running things in the 19th century. And reform started to happen when the great progressive Teddy Roosevelt became president in the early 20th century. And the first act that was done, that Teddy Roosevelt did way back in 1907, more than 100 years ago, was called the Tillman Act of 1907. And what this did is it banned corporations from giving contributions for federal political campaigns. Said that if you have a corporation, you can't buy elections. You're not allowed to give money to campaigns. Now think about it. This is back in 1907. There was no television, there was no radio, there was no mass media like we have now. So the ability to buy elections back in 1907 was nothing like it is now. But back then, the government realized that money in politics was a problem, that it had inherent corruptive possibilities, and they decided to do something about that back in 1907. Okay? Years went by. That's been the law of the land. And nothing actually happened until after the corruption of Watergate in the 70s, when they realized how sleazy politicians can actually be. And the first big statute in the United States was passed dealing with financial reform of campaigns, called the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1972, which was then amended and tinkered with in 1974. And this is what that law did. First, it put limits on the amount of money that individuals could make to campaigns. A certain amount of money, you can write a check for a politician if he's running for president, and that's it. It put limits so that millionaires can't give $1 billion to the presidential campaign. It put limits to keep everyone on a equal footing. Second, it required disclosures. You can't secretly give payoffs to politicians. You had to give disclosures. There had to be accountability as to who was actually writing the checks for campaigns. Third, it allowed for public financing, which is something they call matching funds, that once you're able to raise a certain amount of money, then you're able to get matching funds from the government to make it more of an equal footing, so that you're not wealthy, you can actually get money coming in for your campaign. And finally, it put limits on the amount of money that could be spent by the candidates themselves. As you know, last election, Obama spent more than $1 billion on his campaign. Back in the 1972 law, there was actually a limit that once you hit that certain peak, you could not spend any more than what that limit actually was. They put a cap on the amount that politicians could spend. Well, what happened is that law ended up in the Supreme Court in 1976. There was a case called Buckley versus Valeo, and Buckley reversed part of the Federal Election Campaign Act. Okay? It left parts of it in place. The part saying limits how much money an individual can give to a campaign, there was no problem with that. Required disclosure of contributions, no problem with that. Public financing, no problem with that. But the Supreme Court had a problem with putting limits on how much candidates could spend on their campaign. What the Supreme Court held was that a person running for office has a right to spend their own money as whatever they want, that it's free speech. That to say, hey, you're running for president, you could only put 10 hours of television commercials, you can't spend your personal fortune, that was a violation of free speech. Everything else was upheld by this law, but the Supreme Court of the United States said that you can't put limits on how much a candidate spends on his own campaign, because that would be violating his free speech. And that's why in the last election, Rick Scott was able to, in the state of Florida, spend his hundreds of millions of dollars that he had, his personal fortune, in being able to buy the election in the state of Florida. So Buckley versus Valco said that the Congress cannot put limits on the amount that a politician spends on their own campaign. You can't limit their speech. They can spend anything they want out of their own pocket for their own campaigns. And that's what the actual law is. Okay? But the Supreme Court of Florida said that the government does have a compelling interest in limiting this speech. Okay? Now, like I've talked about before on previous shows, no constitutional rights are without limits. Every right that a person has under the Constitution, the government can always put limits on that right if there's a reason to do so. For instance, you have a right for freedom of speech, but you don't have a right to go into court and commit perjury. Okay, you have a freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded building and cause people to get trampled. There are limits on your rights to free expression, freedom of speech. Okay, and in order for the government to limit those rights, they have to show that there's a compelling interest. So is there a right to spend money on your own campaign? Yes, but the Supreme Court held that the government has an interest in preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption. Therefore, the government can put limits and create financial reform in most areas of election campaign donations. But the one thing they can't do is they can't tell a candidate, here's the cap on the amount of money that you can spend on your own campaign. That's freedom of speech according to the Supreme Court, and there's no corruption inherent in someone spending their own money on their own campaign. It's not like you're giving them money. The government can, under that Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Valeo, put limits on how much I donate to the candidate. That's could be corruption. That could be considered to be quid pro quo. I'm buying their viewpoint on a particular piece of legislation for a check. That could be regulated by the government, but you can't tell the candidate themselves, here's how much you can spend. That's protected by freedom of speech. Okay, and that's how the Supreme Court held it in the 70s. And that was the law of the land through the 90s as well. There was a case of Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, 1990. And what happened in that case is the state of Michigan passed a law saying that corporations cannot spend any money dealing with state elections. Corporations cannot spend any money. Supreme Court of the United States upheld that and said that it was legal to ban corporations from spending money in state elections. They said that the government had an interest in combating corruption and corrosive and distorting effects of immense aggregations of wealth, which was occurring. You don't want large corporations to buy state legislatures like they actually are doing right now in the Carolinas and throughout the Deep South. It's absolutely horrible which is going on. But the Supreme Court was upholding the ability to tell corporations, keep your money out of politics. You cannot spend money in state elections, okay? Then the law got really cool in 2002. Under 2002, there was a new law passed called McCain-Feingold. John McCain, who I'm not a fan of, has a lot of integrity when it comes to campaign finance reform. And he sponsored a bill which became the law of the land in 2002, signed by George W. Bush, which eliminated soft money to national party committees, put limits of hard money contributions, again, put limits on the amount of money that can be contributed to political campaigns, and also passed a law saying that there could not be any corporate or union money spent for any political purposes within 30 days of a primary election or 60 days of a general election. So if you want to put a bunch of public service ads in your corporation, you can put them anytime you want, but you can't put them 60 days before the election. If you're putting them 60 days before the election, then you're violating the law under McCain-Feingold. That was what the law was like in 2002. But then it all hit the fan in 2003. By 2003, 2003, our law went to the Supreme Court. They challenged McCain-Feingold, and it got upheld. The Supreme Court of the United States said in 2003 that McCain-Feingold was still good law. Okay? They upheld it. Okay? Barely. 5-4 decision. 5 judges said it's the law of the land. 4 judges said no, it violates freedom of speech. Okay? Now, if you look at the people who dissented back then, the 4 who were in the minority, it was Rehnquist, Scalia, Kennedy, and Thomas. Rehnquist has been off the court. He retired. He was replaced by John Roberts. John Roberts is politically very similar to Rehnquist in his beliefs. So if Rehnquist dissented, odds are Roberts would dissent as well. But Sandra Day O'Connor, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, upheld the law. Even though she was a Republican, she agreed that McCain-Feingold was constitutional. And because it was constitutional, the government can put actual limits and actually bar corporations from campaigning and putting on ads 60 days before the election. Okay? However, things change. Sandra Day O'Connor is no longer on the Supreme Court. She retired and was replaced by Samuel Alito, another right-wing fanatical activist who pretends that they believe in they call themselves conservatives. The definition of conservative is following precedent. saying that, well, this was decided by the courts a long time ago, and therefore we're going to follow this precedent. It's been settled, as opposed to changing the law and coming up with radical ideas. But in reality, that's what these people are. They're radicals, because although the Supreme Court in 2003 upheld McCain-Feingold, in 2006, things started changing. Now that Alito's on the Supreme Court, things started changing. And the first case where you saw this effect, that the Supreme Court was no longer on the side of protecting our country from corruption, from all the money that's flowing into political campaigns, was in a case called Randall versus Sorrell. In that case, Vermont put limits on the amount of money that people can donate to campaign contributions. Even though limits on contributions was upheld under McConnell versus FEC, although limits were upheld by Buckley versus Valeo and by Austin versus Michigan, in this particular case, the Supreme Court said that it's unconstitutional. The Vermont limits on campaign contributions in state elections was declared to be unconstitutional violations of the Supreme Court. Well, what changed? One person in the court. Alito took over for Sandra Day O'Connor. A right-wing zealot took the place of Sandra Day O'Connor. Okay? Which leads us to the most famous case ever on financial reform, which was the Citizens United versus FEC case in 2009. So now that you have a background, let me explain to you what happened with the FEC case, okay? The FEC case is dealing with that one issue about whether or not corporations can do ads 60 days before the election. And what happened in this case is there was a corporation, a lobbying group called Citizens United. And what Citizens United wanted to do was they made this anti-Hillary Clinton movie during the race, in which they just wanted to bash Hillary, and they wanted to show it shortly before the election, which would be a violation of the McCain-Feingold law. Okay, so of course they tried to shut him down. It went to the Supreme Court. Okay. And the Supreme Court ruled, despite all these years in precedents, ruled that McCain-Feingold, the limits on spending by corporations, which has been upheld for years, is now unconstitutional. They overturned Austin. They overturned McConnell. What changed? One thing changed. Alito's on the court. O'Connor's no longer on the court. Okay? Now, what did they do? They used warped logic. They cited the case Buckley to show that that it's unconstitutional because Buckley dealt with political corruption. But Buckley had nothing to do with corporations. Buckley dealt with an individual's right to speak, not saying corporations have a freedom of speech. What this court did is it gave a right of freedom of speech, a constitutional right that was never intended by the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers did not. People are born with fundamental rights. Corporations are not human beings. Corporations are fake people. Corporations are set up by government entities to avoid liability, to promote business. They are not born with inalienable rights that come from God or come from nature. And to say that they have these rights of freedom of speech is something that was just created. It was judicial activism, which is what conservatives are supposed to abhor. But they did it anyway. And what happened was the Supreme Court said that corporations have constitutional rights to freedom of speech, and they said that it's being violated, and they used Buckley as precedent, even though all Buckley said was that you can't tell a candidate what they're doing with their money. Yes, a candidate has a freedom of speech. If I am running for president and I have $1 million and I want to spend it on a commercial for myself, advocating my views, I have a right to spend it. But a corporation is very different. And that's what Buckley was about. It was wrong precedent, but they were reaching. They had an agenda here, which was to help big corporatists, which the Supreme Court is basically on the side of, over the individual. Corporations are artificial business entities. Not only that, but it's also not fair. Who really speaks for a corporation? If I own stock in McDonald's and McDonald's wants to advocate a position which is against mine, what right does McDonald's have to say, no, we're taking this political position? A corporation is made up of many shareholders, and the minority members of the shareholders, their rights are actually being violated if the corporation takes money, business money that's supposed to be for the shareholders, and spends it on campaign financing to promote whatever personal agenda that whoever is making that decision, probably the president of the corporation, is actually making. Okay? Now, as a result of this horrible decision by the Supreme Court, there became something newly created in our country called the super PAC. Bum, 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 bum. Look, up in the air. Is it a bird? It's a plane. It's a super PAC. Now, what is a super PAC besides eating their spinach and having a lot of superpowers? What these super PACs are is they're corporations. Super PACs are corporations that are created for purposes of taking in money from the public so they can make commercials and spend them in campaigns. See, when they originally were writing laws about putting limits on corporations, what they were thinking about was, for instance, McDonald's. McDonald's not liking the fact that Michelle Obama is against fast food because it makes kids fat. So they put on campaign commercials bashing Obama. That would be what people would normally think about as corporate financing of a campaign. But that's not what super PACs are. Super PACs are created corporations. It's not a corporation which has an idea, let's say something. No, people have the idea to say something and then create the corporation in order to suck in the money. So there are limits right now on the amount of money that people can spend in campaigns. An individual can only write a certain amount of money for each campaign. However, you can get around that. If you want to, let's say you don't like President Obama, okay? So you want to create a super PAC, and you can call the super PAC Americans for Freedom and Patriotism. Okay, you create a super PAC called that. And then you take millions of dollars from you and your like-minded friends, and you fund that super PAC, which is a corporation. Well, then that corporation can then put these ads bashing Obama, saying whatever they want, spending millions or billions of dollars promoting their own agenda without any accountability. These aren't really corporations. They're fake corporations being set up just for this sole purpose. A sole purpose of getting around the limitations that were upheld as constitutional on an individual's ability to give money to particular campaigns. Okay? That's what these super PACs actually are. They allow people to just write checks, and they do it secretly. You don't know who's really funding these ads. People go on television and they cry about, oh, Obamacare is terrible, 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 and you don't really know who's actually sponsoring it. The people who actually sponsor it are people like the Koch brothers, multi-billionaires who have an agenda of getting rid of Obama out of office so they can pass things that are good for big oil. Okay? It's all bait and switch. It's all about mirrors. It's all about not letting the public know the truth. That's what this allows, the growth of the super PAC. Okay? Horrible precedent, allowing these large corporations, these fake corporations, to go up there and try to buy elections by dumping too much money in there. And the problem with this is when you put so much money in a political process, okay, forget about bribery, forget about all of that. It stops the congressmen from doing their jobs. As opposed to writing laws, as opposed to trying to negotiate, as opposed to trying to do what's right for its American constituency, because it's necessary in order to compete, to raise money, to beat the guy who's raising more money than you, the politicians spend most of their time raising money. They spend the majority of their time talking to donors on the phone, going to fundraisers, going to luncheons. They care less about governing and more about campaigning. It becomes an entire cycle in which the entire time you're in office, you're doing nothing but trying to raise money. Why? Because they're allowing super PACs to allow big money to come in to campaigns and then spend without any type of regulation. That's a huge problem. Do you think the politicians really care what you think or what you believe in? They don't care about your $5, $10, $20 donation when they can get millions of dollars coming in through the super PACs. Okay? Guess what? A new case came down Supreme Court last week called McCutcheon versus FEC. Okay? Again, attacking McCain-Feingold. Under McCain-Feingold, remember I talked to you about how there's limits about how much you can put on campaign contributions. The way the law is right now, the maximum check that a person can honestly put on a campaign contribution is $2,600. You can write a check for $2,600, and there's for each candidate that's running for office, with a maximum of $46,200 a year. Okay, so 46,200 years divided by 2,600 is the amount of candidates that you can actually give the maximum amount of money to. Okay, somebody, a guy named McCutcheon, said, well, that's not fair. There's hundreds and hundreds of people I want to give money to. I support everybody running all over the United States, and to say that I can only give them a total amount of $46,200, that violates my freedom of speech. So what did the Supreme Court do? Supreme Court said, you know what? That's right. It's violating your freedom of speech. And they, again, quoted the Buckley case. However, Buckley has nothing to do with campaign contributions. Buckley said that you can't limit the politician from spending his own money on a campaign, which, again, is fine by me. If I'm running for president and I want to spend my own money to buy ads on television, then yes, that's freedom of speech. But what McCutcheon does is McCutcheon is saying that the Supreme Court considers it to be speech, merely writing a check to a politician or to a political candidate. That's not speech. There's a big difference between writing a check to somebody and then, or saying something on your own. I'm talking right now, this is protected speech by the Constitution, but writing a check to a politician so that hopefully you can get a political favor down the road, that's not freedom of speech. If I give $50 to a hooker, they're going to put my ass in jail. But you can give money to politicians, and that's protected speech. And saying that putting a limit of 46,200 is wrong. What this will allow politicians to do is, if you're a wealthy Republican donor, you can now, before you had to handpick who you want to give the money to. Oh, I want to write a check out for the maximum for president. I want to write a check out for maximum the governor, the senator, my House representative. Okay, now if you're a Republican millionaire or billionaire who wants to put the extreme right, you can now write a check for every election in the United States, every federal election, every state election, every local election. You can write checks for everything from everywhere in the United States. Even if you don't live in Florida, you can give millions, you can give the maximum amount to people living in the state of Florida. Okay, what's that going to do? That's going to make every election be able to be bought. Even state elections are going to now be very expensive. You're going to start seeing for state legislature ads on television running 24 hours a day. All it's about is chasing money so that you can get elected. That's all it's about. Okay, what's going to happen in the future? Well, the future is, what I think is going to happen is, the fact that under Randall Sorrell they struck down all limits in Vermont on campaign contributions, I think that's what's going to happen next under Russ Feingold. Russ Feingold is going to get killed, and all that's going to happen is people can give whatever they want without any regulations, without any scrutiny, and that's just the way it is. You can buy elections. We are in America not for the people, but for the very rich. That's where we're heading. Why? Because the very rich politicians appointed these people in the Supreme Court. It's not a coincidence that all the people who are for getting rid of campaign finance reform are Republicans. And I really admire John McCain for bucking his party and doing the right thing and being a patriot here. But what is important is if one person, people don't think that voting matters, but you have to vote. We cannot allow the Supreme Court to continue to be appointed by hardcore fanatical right-wingers like happened under the Bush administration, like happened under the Reagan administration. Okay, right now there's 4 liberal-minded people in the court. We need to make sure that the next president is Democratic so that if one of the liberals retires, it's replaced by another liberal, or we can swing the court back to something more moderate by replacing one of the crazy conservatives if they retire off the court with someone who's either more moderate or more liberal. So, I didn't take any phone calls tonight. I had a lot to say, and I had fun saying it. I got my award right here, and I'm really glad that I'm able to fight for you. Once again, 3 things you can do in life. One thing you can do in life is go along with the flow. Who cares? Let the courts do whatever. I want to watch basketball tonight. Number 2, okay, ignore it. What? There's a problem? What's the problem? I don't know about any problem. Oh, I'll just drink beer instead. Or the third thing you can do is you can try your best to become educated, to try to talk about things with other people, to try to change their minds, become an advocate, become a political leader yourself, have your own show, do something. Okay? Because as long as you're doing something, in my opinion, you're fighting back. Thank you. I'll see you next week.
This program was brought to you by the Internet Broadcasting Organization, setting the standard for new media broadcasting.